we're the specific New Zealand wheeling every single time I see something. So, can you take a picture?
All right. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm really excited to be the first Forbes talker. This presentation, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the research that we've done. My background, I worked for an organization called Press Plus, which was a technology company that started in 2009 that helped news publishers find different ways to charge users for access, using different models of doing that. So we were trying to kind of go beyond the concept of a paywall or a hard lock on content and try different ways of protecting content and asking people to pay for it. And that eventually became Piano Media, which is still around today. And since then I've been working with the Worldpeaceever Institute, which is a nonprofit that's all about helping news organizations, particularly local media, but all kinds of journalism organizations, find ways to support quality journalism in the digital era. So through that, we've been able to do all of this research between, starting from Press Plus really, but especially at Worldpeaceever, been able to get data from more than 500 publishers of all different types. Many of them are newspapers, but I'll talk about that in a second. About business models for journalism, about the unit economics of content, and in particular about digital subscriptions and reader revenue models where consumers and readers are paying. So first, some context. There really, a few years ago, there was sort of a big debate around the concept of charging people for content in any way. On the one side, there was the internet wants to be free and content wants to be free, and the other was journalism as a business is changing and in many ways declining, and publishers looking for ways to support digital news. And what we've seen now is that there's been a big shift away from the question of, can I ask people to pay for content? Can I get consumers to pay for content? And now really the conversation is, how can I do that in a way that supports quality journalism? And what are the best practices and what are the different dials I should turn and different tactics I should use? The reason for that, by and large, is that there's been this sort of industry-level sea change in the advertising business, where increasingly a huge percentage of advertising revenue is really going to platforms and third parties and not directly to publishers. This makes sense for a lot of reasons, but as a result, publishers have really had to find a different way to think about revenue. And another element of this is the content itself. So when you look at, sorry, this slide's a little hard to read properly from your seats, but when you look at what drives revenue in a digital advertising model only, it's clicks, it's page views. And so the content that's going to get the most page views may sometimes be something like this article that I have here, 16 hilarious times people made the mistake of wearing red to Target. It's very entertaining, it gets a lot of clicks. On the right-hand side of the same slide, you have a really great investigative piece done by the Philadelphia Inquirer about literal toxic drinking water in their city that won a Pulitzer Prize. And the Target story got 5 times more volume if you measure success only as total clicks. So that's just some context to what we're talking about. So at Worldpeaceever, as I said, we've been able to track benchmarks, gather best practices from over 500 publishers. What do I mean by publishers? It's a mix of, a lot of the data comes from newspapers, national and metro newspapers, local and regional newspapers. That's the vast majority of it. Though we have found that a lot of these data points apply more or less to other types of publications. And some of the data also includes digital-only brands, magazines, B2B publications, etc. And just some more context, on where some of this, one particular source of data in 2018 at LendFest, we partnered with Facebook. We created this thing called the Digital Subscription Accelerator with Facebook, where we had 14 publishers for a 12-week period, and we had experts come in and teach them all about how to get people to pay for content. And that was hugely successful. We generated all this value for the publishers in terms of added lifetime revenue and more customers they were in touch with. So some of the best practices here, some of the data come from that experience as well. So here are some things we've learned. This is just some of it, so when we get to the Q&A, please ask whatever questions are on your mind. Let's let this one kind of through. But one thing we've learned is that news publishers can convert the most loyal percentage of their audience into paying subscribers. That may not be 50% of your audience, but it can be some 5 to 10% or some single-digit percent of your audience. And for publishers with really large digital audiences, that number can be as large or larger than what they used to, what many publishers used to do in the print era. And so if you think about what is the total kind of market size for any publisher in terms of digital subscriptions, it's quite large. It's take your audience and it's the most engaged percentage of that audience. You can get them to pay for content. We have benchmarks on this. I'll talk more about that in a second. Putting that number in context, though, again, we said a small percentage. Well, a lot of publishers think about this in terms of a funnel. It's not like a groundbreaking metaphor in marketing, but still it's useful here. So you've got a portion of your funnel, which is your entire audience, your entire reach, everybody who the entire market, down to everybody who's part of your digital audience, to people who are what I call regular readers, folks who come frequently enough that they have some real engagement with the brand. Stock users is people who actually get a message because of how often they use it. They get some sort of message asking them to pay, and then subscribers. And the smallest sliver is, but the most important sliver of your audience is engaged subscribers, folks who not only pay for content, but love the fact that they pay for content, and they come every day and access content from you. You could turn that funnel on its side and just say this is the customer experience for an individual customer. It follows basically the same path from maybe you're not aware of your brand, so your first stage is to make them know who you are, having actually tried it out and experienced your content, building a habit, preferring you over other brands, because nowadays there's so many digital media sources asking you to pay for content that you need to choose between them, and eventually being loyal and telling other people to subscribe. And so as I said, publishers today are starting to shift. Again, this is another, similar to the kind of broad change I talked about in the industry earlier. I think we're seeing a broad shift in the industry from publishers thinking about clicks and volume as the only measure of success to thinking about engagement. And in these benchmarks, which I won't go into all the details, they're in the white paper, but we think about engagement in terms of frequency of use. How often does a user consume content? Or how much content do they consume in a time period? And so what we've seen is publishers who are really serious about getting people to pay for their content are increasingly focused on defining success as how many people can I get in my audience who access 5 articles a month or 10 articles a month, or who subscribe to my newsletter and actually open it a number of times a month. So looking at these metrics where it's a number of people who are really engaged in the content, and that's how they're defining success. And that's some of the benchmarks we have here are about. The reason for this, of course, is that there's a really significant correlation between engagement and propensity to subscribe, propensity to retain, to stay subscribed. Every study that's looked at this has found basically the same thing, which says if you're more engaged, you're more likely to actually subscribe, and if you are subscribed, you're more likely to keep your subscription than somebody who's paying for it and not using it. It's not that surprising of a finding, but it's good to have data that supports it. Another change we've seen over time is that publishers now, this is a metric called stop rate on this slide. It's basically the percentage of your audience that you actually ask to pay for something. So if you have a metered approach where maybe 5 articles a month are free and then you have to pay in the New York Times, you're only asking usually a small percentage of your readers to pay because they're the only ones who consume that much content. what we've seen is that number has gone up over time. It's still way too low for many publishers. The median benchmark is like 3.5%, a little bit, almost 4%. But the publishers that are really kind of focused on digital subscriptions and are doing really well, they're stopping a much larger percentage of their audience with a meter or with a paywall or some sort of pay-for-content mechanism. The most common of those is the metered model specifically. So just to talk about that specifically, you look at the distribution of all the publishers we have data for, and looking at how much content can you consume before they ask you to pay. For most publishers, it's 5 articles or fewer in a month. It used to be above 10 a few years ago, so it's really declined over time. It's gotten lower over time. I think that's a good thing. I think for a lot of publishers, it's still too high. And there's a bit of an interplay. The thing on the left side of this slide is basically talking about how publishers start looking at that metric of stop rate. What percentage of my audience do I actually ask to pay? They can start to turn, they have really 2 dials to turn. One is how tightly are my access rules set so that somebody, maybe if you only ask somebody to pay after 3 articles, you'll stop more people than if you ask them after 5 articles. And the other is, can I get my audience to consume more? And so changing your access rules is the easier of those 2 to do. Getting people more engaged is probably more important to do over time. Publishers are also playing around with a lot of other mechanisms, ways of thinking about when do you stop somebody and ask them to pay, from changing the time frame of the meter. So if it's 5 articles every 30 days, you want to stop more users. You could say 5 articles every 45 days or every 90 days. You can target people differently based on their geography, based on what content they're accessing, based on what we call propensity scoring, basically looking at everything you know about them and guessing at how likely they are to subscribe. I'll talk about that in a second as well. So that's another big piece of this, is we've seen a lot of experimentation on that front. The other thing, conversion. So, okay, once you stop somebody and ask them to pay, you have to get them to actually do it. And that's really about optimizing e-commerce and optimizing your marketing pitch. The good news is that conversion rates are also increasing generally across the industry, especially for publishers that have really put a priority on paid content. So the benchmark here is a metric called the paid stop conversion rate. It's the percentage of stopped users who convert in a given month. Again, the median is fairly low, but the publishers that are performing well, if you do the math, that conversion rate will lead to a growing subscription business generally. And part of that is publishers are just getting a lot smarter about how they think about what does it mean for somebody to be likely to subscribe, or when is somebody going to subscribe, and when are they unlikely to subscribe no matter what kind of offer I put in front of them. So, a few years ago, the only thing publishers were really doing to increase conversion rate was putting a discount in front of a user, 50% off or something. Now there's a lot more targeting and things going on where you can look at all of these data points, like, does somebody subscribe to your newsletter? And if they do, have they actually opened 3 newsletters in the past week or in the past 2 weeks or whatever? Does somebody follow me on social media? Does somebody access my content on multiple devices? Do they read content from multiple categories? Those are some of the strongest, generally some of the strongest factors that correlate with likelihood to subscribe. And so publishers are figuring out, slicing and dicing their audience, figuring out who falls into what category, and saying, okay, based on that, I'm going to either present somebody with a request to pay or decide not to ask them yet, and instead do something like ask for their email address, that kind of thing. And just as we've seen conversion rates increasing, we've also seen pricing increase. So the broad brush of this is that basically every year that we've ever been able to collect a pricing benchmark from a bunch of publishers, the number's been higher, and it's been higher pretty steadily by a similar amount. It's not like it's not an exponential curve, but it's like a straight increase in price. What I attribute that to, by and large, is that a lot of publishers went from fully free digital products to asking people to pay, and they had no idea what their content was worth or what consumers thought it was worth. And so now what most publishers do is they picked a price that was like a round number. Sometimes it was, $5 a month a few years ago. Now it's probably $10 a month, roughly. And then they used multivariate testing to try different prices and see, is my conversion rate better? Is my retention rate lower because I've increased price? And by and large, they found that there's room to increase price. And a lot of publishers started with assumptions that were a bit too low and have increased over time. The median for a newspaper, a daily newspaper right now, is about almost $12 a month. But that's just the median. There's all sorts of variation. And so, last slide of data here, and then we can get to questions and conversation, is about looking at all this stuff combined. We were able to sort of pick apart the unit economics of digital content, or how, at least a way that publishers can think about that. And so what I mean is, on the one hand, you're generating revenue, if you produce digital content, on the one hand, you're generating revenue from advertising on page views. And there's a certain amount of digital advertising you sell that's direct sold advertisements that have a pretty high rate. And at the margins, as you add another 1,000 page views or 2,000 page views, it's mostly monetized with programmatic advertising. And so you pretty much know as a publisher, if somebody adds 1,000 page views this month, how much extra revenue are they going to add? Similarly, based on customer lifetime value, which is an estimate of how much revenue any one subscriber will generate over the total lifetime of their subscription. You can estimate how much is one digital subscriber. And so we took those numbers and we looked at, from a particular publisher that was willing to share all of their data, including ad data, said they had a $7.16 ad yield from 1,000 page views. It's a little bit low, but that's where they were. Some publishers would probably be a bit above that. And they had an average customer lifetime value of $345 per customer because the retention was very high and the pricing was a bit aggressive compared to other publishers. And so for them, one new subscriber that they could generate is the same as generating 48,000 page views on their content. And most folks in the newsroom probably didn't think about it in those terms and might not even think about the value of adding one new subscriber at all. And so there's a lot of implications of that, but one of the recommendations, some of the recommendations we have in the white paper and that I've talked about elsewhere are really around aligning organizations around the definition of success, where in a model where you have a mixture of ad revenue and subscriber revenue or reader revenue, getting everybody on the same page about what does successful content look like? How do we think about what is our strategy? If an article does well, what does that mean? Did it appeal to subscribers? Did it generate a lot of page views? Did it have to do both? And trying to really spread that throughout a news organization. So with that, I'll take some questions and we can just sort of have a conversation about any reactions to that or stuff I didn't mention here that if you've read the white paper, that anything that's in the white paper, or just generally anything you all want to talk about.
So a lot of the metrics you had were, well, first, thank you, this is really cool. A lot of the metrics you had were kind of like mid-funnel around conversion in terms of the stop rate or, getting people to convert in the first place.
Yeah.
But I know that you also mentioned, obviously the bottom of the funnel is very important to get subscribers to retain. Are there any benchmarks that you have in terms of for example, month one, year one retention that we should go over?
So there are some retention benchmarks in the white paper. I didn't put them in the deck just for time, as well as customer lifetime value benchmarks, mostly taken from newspapers. From the newspaper industry. So I did sort of shortchange retention in general here a little bit, again for time, but it's, especially as more and more publishers have digital subscription models that are a big part of their business, that's actually probably becoming the bigger focus for a lot of publishers. The nice thing is that if you're focused on content that engages readers, generally that helps with retention anyway, but all of the metrics that I talked about for a user who's not a subscriber, like engagement, regular readers, all of those, whether they've opened their emails, email newsletters, etc., all of those also correlate with likelihood to stay subscribed. And so there's a nice resonance there where you're not serving different goals really by some of this.
You talked a lot about how to identify potential paid subscribers via your existing emails, newsletters, or current however they subscribe. But I noticed that you may not have touched on in your white paper for marketing. New York Times is pretty open about this. Like they have a huge marketing budget on top of identifying those that are reaching those 6 articles.
Yeah.
How do you kind of factor that in with your model?
So in general, I mean, I have a whole presentation on marketing specifically. In general, the publishers that are have the highest conversion rates, like one of the big things they're doing differently is they're actually doing a lot of proactive marketing, and they're really invested in that. So, you know, one way to think about it is once you understand the metrics around the value of a digital subscriber to your organization, in addition to that helping with content decisions and how you think about what is successful content, it also helps with marketing decisions because, you know, when publishers first started launching digital subscription models a few years ago, most of the marketing they did was like routed down to free, right? It was on their own channels, it was on their own site, it was emails to users where they already had the email address. Now we've seen, and this is one of the big things that came out in the Facebook Accelerator program that we did at LenFest, that there is a good return on investment, often a good return on investment for paid digital marketing. So whether it's recirculation, where you're just trying to use like paid spend on Facebook or elsewhere to kind of increase engagement in general, or whether it's conversion marketing, where you're putting an ad in front of people that says subscribe to the New York Times because you want to support quality journalism or for some other reason. And I think we've seen a lot of success with marketing that's like, so a lot of publishers start with the assumption that the message of like, subscribe because like democracy needs it or because it's good for you, it's good to support journalism. I think a lot of publishers will start thinking, assuming that message will resonate, or even like, look how many Pulitzers we've won, you know, so pay for us. And actually found that like some of the most successful marketing messages are really basic messages that work in every other industry. Like the Boston Globe did a big test where they had 2 messages compared side by side. One was about all their Pulitzers and the history of holding the corrupt to account in Boston, and the other was snow day sale, 50% off. And snow day sale won by a lot. So the one thing is like, it's not actually that complicated to market digital subscriptions. It's not that different from marketing any other product when you're talking about, especially when you're talking about paid ad spend or promotions like that. A lot of the time it's just put a good offer in front of people, message them a few, consistently so that they think about it enough times and eventually they'll pay.
To that note, I was going to ask you about, because I will sign up for anything that gives me like a free merch. Is that part of this, like, have you seen publishers do that to get subscribers?
I have.
Does that work or no?
Well, it depends on the publisher, I think.
Yeah.
So usually with free merchandise, the publishers for whom that will work, they have an audience that wants to identify themselves in some way based on the fact that they agree that publisher. So like, there's plenty of people who want to carry a New York Times tote bag. There are probably plenty of people who want to have a Breitbart coffee mug on their desk because it says something about who they are. There's, may not be, there's plenty of publications where that might not really be what the audience is there for, like where they're, this is where understanding why your audience wants to want to subscribe is really important. Like some publications, people mostly subscribe because it's helpful to them in their job. And for them, they may not really have an affinity with it. They may not care if you send them a mug, and it might just be a waste of money. One easy way to deal with that is to test, both offers, and you can probably do the math of here's how much extra it costs me to send them the tote bag or the mug or whatever, and here's how much extra conversion I need to make it worth it. And if you get it, then move forward.
Did you find any substantial difference between publishers who might have presented that sort of stop after X amount of articles and say, can you subscribe here, versus a publisher that might have said upon visiting their platform, like, hey, you have 5 free articles, and then you're gonna have to subscribe, something along those lines?
Yeah, so what the data said, I mean, I haven't collected data on this in a couple of years, but so maybe it's changed in the last 2 or 3 years, but last time I looked at it, the data we had said overwhelmingly that if you let people know that they will eventually have to subscribe, not only will they be more likely to subscribe, but also the other concern publishers have about doing that is people will self-limit their consumption or something, and we basically found they don't self-limit at all, and they appreciate knowing about it beforehand. They're much more likely to subscribe if you've given them a heads up.
Have you looked at all at exclusive content versus the pay meter? And do you have any, did one of those win? And I see Business Insider now, they have, you'll get to an article and they just won't let you read it because it's behind this exclusive paywall. And that implies they have, I guess, editors creating content just for that. I'm just curious what you're doing.
So it definitely does depend on the publisher, and Business Insider is interesting for a couple of reasons. I'll talk about that in a second. So broadly speaking, the data says that the meter works a little bit better. And the main reason for that is, I think, is that if you go with a premium content route, where you basically, as the publisher, pick and choose which content you think is valuable, number one, you're always kind of trying to get into your readers' heads in a way you maybe don't need to, and you're always going to be overlooking some group of readers that think some content is valuable that you as an editor might not. So, as an example, some newspapers have found that they have a really high, not like it's their main source of conversions, but a surprisingly high conversion rate on obituaries. And when they did research to find out why, who are these people? Are they really morbid or something? It turned out they're using it for business. Those are big, they're financial estate planners, things like that, and that was a business lead generation tool for them. So yeah, they'll pay for it as morbid as it sounds. It was useful to them. You're never going to really predict that as an editor picking and choosing, and most folks don't want to have to pay an obituary for somebody who they know. So the meter, the logic says the meter allows the casual reader to see that interrupting them, but it allows the person who's really addicted to that content to have to pay. There is an exception though, which is so Business Insider actually has been really successful with this, where they'll be writing about something that's so niche that there's not, it's like a particular article about a particular industry, about some executive that there's maybe 500 people in the world who care, but some percentage of them will definitely pay just for that content. And so when you get really targeted like that, I think they've had a lot of success with that model. So I can't say that a premium model, content model doesn't work. I just think it's by and large the data says the meter works a little bit better.
For all the data that you presented, is it exclusively web content, or do you have any examples the exclusive content that you think of a publisher that may have podcasts or videos or anything like that, and kind of does that increase a likelihood to pay, or how do those kind of other platforms impact?
Yeah, so we don't have benchmarks from podcasts or video content really at all. I did do some research on a couple of publishers like Slate that had a really successful podcast component to their membership model, and they had basically what they did is they had some probably subscribed, but they had several wildly successful podcasts that were free for almost everybody, but they had a separate episode with each episode that was behind the episode that went even deeper, and that was for Slate Plus members only, and that converted really well. But of course, that's almost like a metered model for audio, where you were able to get the main content for free, and then to get even more, you had to pay. So it sort of followed the freemium approach. But I know that has been a huge driver of memberships for that.
It's interesting, on one of the slides where I think you had the average cost per month compared to various publications, it was a pretty steady line, except that between 2 of the years there was a pretty significant jump. It was 2012 or 2013 or something like that. Do you recall what the catalyst was behind such a substantial jump?
So I don't remember exactly the details, but I believe one of the big, we live in an era of media consolidation, so one of the big newspaper companies with like 200 publications fluctuate prices across the board, so that had a noticeable product.
Was your data able to look at like the number of subscribers across different publications? So if one person subscribed 18 ones, there's one publication that did that like lessen the chance of them becoming one subscribers to another one?
The data we publish doesn't include that. I do know from other research that, and I hope I don't cite this wrong because it wasn't my own research, but I believe the numbers I have basically say, you look at all people who pay for news, the drop-off between paying for one publication and two publications is like 70% or something, and between two publications and more than two is like almost all of the rest of the group. So basically most people only pay for one news source right now, maybe two, and that is something that I'm really curious to see where that goes. Like overall, more people paying for news has led to more, like the number of people paying for news has gone up, but the number of different sources they pay for has not yet. So I think a lot of publishers are looking at the question of, does there need to be like a Spotify or Netflix model for news? And there have been some attempts at that. No one can really figure out how the business model of that should work and how it would work for both publishers. And anyway, I don't know what's going to happen with that, but I'm very curious to see, because I do think there's going to be a problem at some point where consumers kind of hit a limit to how much they're willing to pay for content, and they might not have enough to go around.
How about like between generations? Because obviously like when you're working, it's
Yeah.
pay for content, but when you're still in school and younger and you
Right.
want to access news.
Right.
Not enough access.
Exactly. Though I do know a lot of publishers, like the New York Times in particular, has had a ton of success with student subscriptions at like a very low rate, or that are either sold direct wholesale to the college, or that are paid for by parents as a gift. And then like they see that as a longer term investment in getting that person as a subscriber, because they now have been doing this long enough to have some data that suggests that actually the folks will eventually
And then do you think it's worthwhile to have like different subscription packages for different generations?
Maybe. I don't know. I think, I wish I knew. I could
Can you
probably.
repeat the question? Sorry, a little louder.
Do you think it's worthwhile to have different subscription packages for different generations?
I think it's worthwhile to have lower prices and like introductory products aimed at younger consumers, maybe who aren't going to want to read the Wall Street Journal every day, but might want to get a package of news that gets them used to the idea of paying for content, especially if you can get it at a discount or get it sold through a gift subscription, something like that. I don't know what that package should look like. I wish I did. Someone should make it.
In any of your research, did you see kind of like what were the biggest trends in terms of why people didn't want to pay for news, or the biggest barriers for paying?
Yeah, so this is another slide I didn't include here, but is in one of the other things. So it's not so much about why people want to pay for news, but what content converts best, what factors about a person suggest they're likely to pay. So I mean, kind of unsurprising, to me at least, is that generally local content, the stuff that is local and more immediately like close to a person's life converts better. A lot of publishers have found that categories of content that generally are like relevant to your decision making in day-to-day life convert better. So that could be everything from like transit content to news about new development in the city that you live in, things like that. But stuff where somebody can make a day-to-day life decision. An example of like that kind of relevant to day life thing is a lot of local publishers have super strong conversion on high school sports content, for example, because it's not a widespread thing, but people who have a student in high school, especially if they're on a sports team, everyone's going to pay for that content. So things like that tend to convert really well. but then there's all these odd categories, as I said, like obituaries that appeal to a certain person, or obviously any content that's useful in a career, which can be quite varied, converts really well. So it depends a little bit on the consumer, but those are some of the broad categories that publishers have found.
What do you pay for?
Good question.
So I have the benefit of having some comp subscriptions to some publications, but I pay for the New York Times, I pay for a couple of other publications at the national level. I got the Wall Street Journal for free through Word. I don't subscribe to a local publication. As a New Yorker, I don't really know if there's like I don't know what the right one is for here. Maybe Daily News or something. I don't know, but if I did live back home in New Jersey where I grew up, I would probably subscribe for the local paper there as well.
Do you think that matters if there are in-house writers versus outside writers writing for the publication? Like obviously New York Times is one that is in-house, it's like a huge publication, but I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so I think okay, so the answer that I think is true, or I would expect to be true, is that originally produced content by that publication converts better. When we tried to find some data point that verified that, we were not able to. Like a lot of local publishers run a ton of wire source content, for example, and it converts just fine. And sometimes it's national news, but so then that kind of told us. Basically, maybe something's wrong about the way we're looking at the data, or maybe our assumption was wrong. But by and large, what resonates with readers does tend to be distinctive content. So you would think that things like wires and other types of content like that wouldn't perform very well, but they never really found a statistically significant data point telling us that was the case.
Did you notice any difference in the data based on acquisition channels? So if people came through SEO or through Medium, does that impact conversion at all as they got to the content?
We don't have data on that specifically. I think generally our assumption is that a lot of people, because most of the data set here is publishers with meter publications, the number of users who hit the meter who came through SEO is going to be lower anyway. Like maybe they originally came through SEO, but then something had them come back enough times to get stopped by the meter. So I would guess that it would be a lower conversion if you're not somebody who has some sort of knowledge of what relationship with that publication, but I don't know for sure.
Every once in a while, it feels like there's this conversation about would people pay for Twitter, right? Like, would you pay 99 cents a month or whatever to access X persons or X people's Twitter feeds? And I think there's at least one company that sort of tried a paid version of what the platform delivers. Do you think that there is room for pay to access a person or a type of content? Do you think not on a macro level, but on a micro level, individual authors or journalists rather, do you think there's room for growth in that space? What's your take on that as a whole?
You mean people paying for a particular content producer's,
Yeah.
Well, I think short answer is yes. One thing I pay for randomly that I forgot on the question before, I'm a baseball fan, and there's one Yankees writer who had a free blog for years and years that I read it because as a baseball fan, and he decided to switch it to a paid Patreon, a thing for $2 a month, and I subscribed for that. So I do think there's models like that have sort of shown that folks will pay for a particular. In fact, I was recently talking to a fellow who runs a site called politicalwire.com, which is gets pretty good traffic, but it's basically an aggregate. I mean, he takes content posted by other publishers, summarizes it, and links to it, and puts a little of his own commentary, and has a $5 a month membership, and it's been surprisingly successful for it's a one-man operation, basically. So I do think that there's and we had paid podcasts, and I think there's some room for growth there. I don't know. Again, I get to the question of okay, if there's one content producer you really love, yes, you might pay for their content. I pay for the baseball writers, thoughts, $2 a month or whatever. At a certain level, a certain number of those, I do think you're going to run into price sensitivity among consumers, where they say, I can't keep paying for all of these things, and that's where I do wonder, are there going to be bundled packages like that, where you kind of take the publisher out of it for some package of content and make it about the person producing it? I don't know.
Do you find that publishers that have breaking news, like for high-profile stars like that, or a lot of the subscription models that say something that's like lifestyle pieces or things like that?
No, not necessarily. I think often, depends on the type of break. Like often, breaking news stories actually will get covered by so many different places if it's a really big story that, unless that publication like really is owning it or providing something distinctive, it's sort of a wash for people. They're happy to read the content there, but they could have gotten it in CNN, the New York Times, Wall Street, whatever. And whereas if you have like really good, distinctive lifestyle content, a lot of people will subscribe because of food content. I know the New York Times had a really successful recipes product that they put together at one point, for example. So there's all sorts of things people will pay for. It's not just breaking news, and sometimes it's news stories that are like not at the level of breaking big stories, but that are day-to-day, a particular beat that's just really relevant to somebody.
You had a nice slide in the middle about knowing your users and identifying the users that are most likely to subscribe. So I'm curious if you're like if a publisher has just an anonymous website, ad-driven, no registration database, they don't really know the customers. Is that sort of the first step, or are there publishers that go straight from there to implementing the subscription model, or do you need to start gathering the first-party data and that kind of stuff?
You don't need to, but it helps a lot. So I think most publishers that have gone through this transition did not start with registration. Many of them had registration, but most of their users hadn't registered, and they had like optional registration. And it worked fine. I think if I were doing it now as a publisher, I would absolutely, because of everything we know about how valuable that relationship is and the data, the fact that if you have someone's email address, you're automatically probably about 10 times more likely to be able to convert that person than if you don't. But if there's barriers to doing that, like the downside of forced registration, for example, is it does hurt page views. If you ask somebody to register on their first click and they don't know who you are, they don't have any relationship with you, you might drive away some casual readers who could eventually become engaged readers. But I would probably, as a publisher, start with what are all the ways I can get somebody to register voluntarily, and then move to where are the points when I can force somebody to register in order to access something, and then look at how can I switch this to a paid model.
For publishers moving from completely free to having like a metered paid model for the first time, what do you think is the biggest mistake you see them making?
So the biggest mistake, there's a few big ones that come up. The biggest mistake is like doing it almost like apologetically. So what I've seen publishers do is they say, okay, we know ad only is not working for us, so we have to put up a paywall. So they'll view it as a technology project where they have to get the paywall up, and that's really what they're doing, as opposed to what it really is, which is a change in their digital business model and a new product that they should be really excited about promoting. And so what they'll do is set the meter limit really high, do no marketing around the rolling it out. They'll just sort of turn it on and people get stopped and don't know what it is. Not do any proactive, even like messaging letter from the publisher or something, and not do any ongoing marketing, and not change the way they think about success of content to focus on engagement. And so what they end up with is a very, very small number of people will sign up still, because those people will pay you anyway, they just love you. But they're missing out on the vast majority of the opportunity. So that's the biggest mistake, is like not really stepping up to the plate and embracing this as something that you're doing as an organization. The kind of secondary to that, that's very similar, is even if they embrace it as at some level in the organization, like they have a consumer revenue or marketing department that really goes for it. The second mistake is not aligning everybody else around it. So where you end up, it's like, that's a marketing team project, but it can't be. It has to be an organizational-wide shift. It has to be something where everybody understands why you're doing it. Everybody's, even if they don't think it's the best idea, at least they've accepted that it's the strategy and that they're part of it, and they understand why it's the strategy, and they understand what success looks like.
So would you say, like, in terms of leaning into marketing it, is that like advocating it as like an advanced product to users, or like this is going to be better for you in some way?
Yeah, it often takes that form, but it can be as simple as like, like first of all, when they roll out the digital subscription product, like doing a big announcement on their site, running house ads that promote the product, having a page that says really proudly, like, get our excellent digital content, and here's all the benefits, and here's why it's a good value. Sending people who you have their email address, marketing emails about it. Things like that, basically just not like apologizing for charging, but instead saying, this is something really great, really worth paying for, and you should want it.
Talked a lot about LTV, lifetime value.
Yeah.
But it's even like churn. It's like churn in 12 months, 18 months, 24 months.
For the LTV, so the data that we have, I think, is based on a 24-month LTV model. I think. But different publishers calculate that differently. And we do have churn metrics as well in the white paper. So you can look at those in here. I also put the LTV benchmark. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts or maybe data on what people are willing to pay for outside of the content itself? Like, for example, like if people are willing to pay for like the ability to use an ad blocker on a website or anything like that?
So I have not actually seen. I've seen lots of publishers put up a prompt that asks you to either pay or take off your ad blocker. The main result of that is that you get a lot of people to take off their ad blocker. I've not seen that people will pay for ad-free in general yet. I'm sure some publisher will come up with it, like we'll do this right and have a really great success story of an ad-free model. I just haven't really seen it yet. And because of ad blockers, a lot of people sort of are used to just not seeing ads at all. And so if you say if that's the main thing you're marketing ad-free, a lot of people just before don't see it as that important. But all the other types of things like that. So I've seen publishers include things like access to events or ways to sort of connect more directly to people at the organization. As a benefit of a subscription, and even though a relatively small percentage of readers will take them up on that, it still has an impact on retention. And sometimes personalization features, etc., on the various digital products that you have. Ad-free specifically has not been a big one.
Through any of the data that you looked at, has there been any difference in terms of positioning? Like, for example, a subscription versus a membership versus like a donor or like anything like that?
So we actually, we worked with lots of membership publishers too. Most of this data is from newspapers who position it generally as a subscription. The data about that basically said it didn't matter that much whether you call it a membership or a subscription. As long as the product included some access that you couldn't get. So like, if it's a membership but it's really just a donation, that's going to have a different conversion rate, a lower conversion rate generally, and also a lot more peaks and valleys. Like donation models, they'll have like one big story that causes a flood of donations, and then you look at the rising, whereas a membership or subscription tends to be more steady. I've always slightly preferred the subscription way of positioning myself. because I think most people do subscribe for the content, and so it kind of communicates an exchange of value in that sense, but data said it didn't matter that much. Any more questions? Sorry.
Just got like a bunch of them.
Yeah.
I have a question related to the kind of like ads and subscription model. How are you finding publishers are balancing like having a subscription model with the amount of ads that a user sees on the page?
Yeah. So, I mean, not well overall is the answer. Like, if you go to some, one of my favorite things to do, like when I've done consulting engagement with publishers, is just to go to like a story that they have that was a really good story that should have resonated with, or did resonate with subscribers, and I take a screenshot of all the ads that I see. But yeah, so publishers have a huge problem of ad overload on pages. We know that two like technical product factors that really do have an impact on subscription sales. One is page load time, which has a really big impact, and the other big mistake that a lot of publishers make is ad overload, and those two things are related, obviously. And so the thing is, I understand why publishers do it, because if you are trying to get as much optimized for the most revenue possible, it's very hard to tell exactly what effect having that extra ad is going to have on conversion or retention. And it's very easy to tell how much extra revenue is going to generate by being there. So it's one of those cases where probably if you could have an objective study, you would probably see that publishers make a little bit more revenue over time with slightly fewer ads and a reasonable number and not putting anything too obtrusive out there. But it's very hard to see that day to day as you're making a decision whether or not to run the ad and basically forego some revenue.
That's another question.
Sure.
How are you seeing the organizations like infrastructure, I guess? How are organizations, publishers balancing like the needs of each department? So like revenue versus product versus editorial. Have you seen or like within the data that you've compiled some like golden ratio between how each department works together or is balanced, or who has kind of like the authority to move the needle versus others?
I wish I did. No, I mean it's. So I can tell you what the like really bad cases look like. There's no one right answer. The really bad cases look like everybody is siloed. They have different metrics of success, and like the ad people feel threatened by the consumer revenue people, and vice versa, and the journalists feel bitter toward everybody who keeps putting different metrics in front of them. The generally pretty good cases, there is organizational alignment where, first of all, like at the publisher or CEO level, someone has said this is the strategy, and then they've done a lot of work to kind of socialize that in the organization and said, our strategy is consumer revenue, but we're actually planning on like growing ad revenue too. So it's not that we're trying to sacrifice one for the other, and here's how we're going to do it. And that the ad revenue, the ad sales folks, for example, think about success in terms of, how can I be more efficient in revenue generation from ads? How can I look at engagement and things like that as a way to actually help sell ads? The product people are trying to support, generally, you do have to sort of pick at a certain point or supporting the whole strategy, but often that means making some trade-offs that are better for engagement and maybe a little bit worse for reach. And everybody producing content is focused on generating great content that engages readers, which happens to help with both ad and consumer revenue. Helps more with consumer revenue, but yeah, so that's generally what it's looked like. I know that's not an exact answer, but that's like the big picture where it is. Any others?
Wow, we've actually hit our time.
Cool.
It's 7:30 already. We spoke for an hour. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Wow, yeah, you guys all made my job really easy. I didn't have to moderate or anything. So if there's any other questions that you have, we have till 8, so you can always kind of grab Matthew. But thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Matthew so much for sharing.
Thank you.